The office felt heavier that morning, as if the fluorescent lights themselves were buzzing with anticipation. Danielle smoothed the wrinkles on her blazer and inhaled deeply, the way she always did before big presentations. But this wasn't a presentation. This was supposed to be her moment. 8 years of staying late, cleaning up other people's mistakes, delivering results that made her managers beam. 8 years of telling herself, the next promotion will be mine. And today, finally, her name was expected to be read aloud. She had practiced her smile in the mirror the night before, not too proud, not too meek. She had even drafted a short speech, tucked neatly into her purse, folded between receipts and old business cards. Danielle wasn't just prepared. She was ready to step into the role everyone had hinted was hers. As the staff gathered in the glass-walled conference room, the air turned electric. People shifted in their chairs, some leaning forward with nervous excitement. Danielle's heart raced, each beat loud enough she was sure the colleague next to her could hear. The director stood at the front, holding a crisp sheet of paper. All the signals were there. This was the announcement she had been waiting for. He began with formalities. "Thank you for your hard work. This year has been remarkable." And Danielle could barely listen. She had already leaped ahead in her mind, calling her mother to share the news, seeing her name on the email signature with the new title, proving to herself that all those long nights had meant something. Then, the name was called. It wasn't hers. A murmur of polite claps filled the room. Chairs scraped against the floor as people turned to congratulate the new manager. A man Danielle had once trained. A man who had asked her just weeks ago how to interpret quarterly sales data. Her hands stayed glued to her lap. Her smile stiffened, but her chest burned with disbelief. She tried to remind herself to breathe. No one looked at her. Not directly. Some cast fleeting glances, then quickly averted their eyes as though her disappointment might be contagious. She felt the sting of invisibility, sharper than any outright insult. It was as if, in that moment, her years of effort had vanished, erased by a decision she had no control over. The meeting ended quickly, chatter bubbling up around the newly promoted manager. Danielle rose from her chair, legs trembling, and walked out with her head held high, though every step felt heavier than the last. She kept replaying the scene in her head, the director's voice, the way the room clapped, the moment her name had not been spoken. In the silence of her office, Danielle closed the door and sat down, her hands pressed against the desk to stop their shaking. The speech she had written the night before now felt like a cruel joke, hiding in her purse like an uninvited guest. She thought of her mother, of all the times she had said, "One day your work will speak for itself." But what happens when no one wants to listen? The truth is, this wasn't just disappointment. It was a fracture, the kind that splits open the ground beneath you, because deep down, Danielle couldn't shake the gnawing question. Was this really about merit, or was it about something else? And that question would not leave her alone. Because what Danielle was about to discover would unravel far more than just a missed promotion. If you've ever believed that hard work alone guarantees success, you need to hear Danielle's rest of the story. Stay with me until the end, because the truth behind this decision will make you question everything you thought you knew about fairness in the workplace. Don't forget to like this video, leave a comment about what you would have done in Danielle's place, share this story with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more powerful stories like this one.
Danielle's story didn't begin in that conference room. To understand the sting of that morning, you have to go back through nearly a decade of quiet sacrifices and invisible victories. 8 years earlier, Danielle had walked into the same company as a fresh-faced hire, clutching a notebook and a pen she'd bought with her first paycheck from a college internship. She wasn't naive. She knew the corporate world was tough, but she carried the faith that effort, intelligence, and loyalty would carry her through. And, at first, it seemed to be working. She was always the one volunteering for late nights when a client demanded last-minute revisions. She was the one fixing errors buried in spreadsheets at 11 p.m., the one catching tiny details that saved entire accounts. Her managers praised her dedication. Colleagues leaned on her to cover their gaps. When the company handed out annual performance awards, her name appeared often, embossed on plaques that now lined the wall of her small office. But Danielle noticed something else, too. Each year, when promotions were announced, her name never made it to the list. The first time, she told herself, it's just not my turn yet. The second time, she reasoned, maybe I still need more experience. By the third year, even her friends teased, you're basically running this place, but they keep forgetting to give you the title. There were promises, though. Her direct supervisor once smiled at her after a client presentation and said, you know, Danielle, you've got manager written all over you. Just keep at it. Your time is coming. Another senior leader added during her review, you're indispensable. I can't imagine the team without you. Words like that kept her going. Words that implied the promotion wasn't a matter of if, but when. Yet the when kept stretching further away. The culture of the company wasn't easy to ignore either. It was polished on the outside, glass offices, modern furniture, glossy brochures boasting diversity and inclusion. But inside, there was an unspoken pattern. The people in leadership positions all seemed to look alike. Men in tailored suits, almost all white, trading jokes in the hallway, inviting each other to golf outings. Their camaraderie was tight-knit, impenetrable. Danielle noticed how meetings always seemed to drift toward them, how clients were introduced to them first. Meanwhile, Danielle was often kept behind the scenes. She'd prepare slide decks that others would present. She'd run the numbers that made quarterly reports shine, but the credit would be attributed to the team, or more specifically, the manager who stood at the front of the room. When recognition came her way, it was often softened by a tone that sounded less like respect and more like containment. You're such a hard worker, Danielle. You keep everything running smoothly. Hard worker, reliable, supportive. Not leader, not visionary. Those words were reserved for others, the others whose errors Danielle quietly fixed, the ones whose confidence seemed to grow at her expense. Still, Danielle believed in the system. She believed that if she kept her head down, checked every box, proved herself over and over, the company would reward her. It had to. Because what else could all this sacrifice be for? Her family believed it too. Every holiday, her mother would beam across the dinner table, bragging to relatives, Danielle is on the path to becoming a manager soon. You'll see she's going to break barriers. Danielle would smile, sip her wine, and silently hope her mother was right. So when the whispers of an upcoming promotion began to circulate in the office, the biggest one yet, a manager position in her department, Danielle felt that old spark of hope. Colleagues stopped by her desk with encouraging nods. It's got to be you this time. Even her supervisor hinted, stay sharp, Danielle, the higher-ups are watching. And Danielle believed it. She let herself imagine what the title on her email signature would look like. She thought about the relief of finally being seen not just as a worker, but as a leader. She thought about walking into a client meeting and being introduced as manager, about calling her mother to share the news she'd been waiting years to give. She thought finally, the system is going to deliver on its promise. What she didn't know yet was that the system wasn't built to deliver for someone like her. Danielle's faith was strong, but cracks were beginning to form, and soon the first signs would appear that her climb up the corporate ladder was never meant to reach the top rung.
The first signs didn't appear as loud slams of doors or outright denials. They came quietly, disguised as small decisions, casual remarks, and assignments that seemed harmless until they began to form a pattern. Danielle had been with the company long enough to know how the game was played. The people who got promoted were the ones who stood at the front of the room, shaking hands with clients, taking ownership of presentations, and making their voices the ones executives remembered. It wasn't just about the work you did, it was about the visibility you had.
and visibility was exactly what Danielle was being denied. Whenever a new project came in, Danielle was tasked with the back end. "You're so detail-oriented," her manager would say, sliding a thick folder across her desk. "Why don't you handle the analytics and Mark can run the client meeting?" Danielle nodded, because that's what a team player did. But deep down, she knew Mark wasn't the one who had built the model that impressed the client. Mark wasn't the one who had stayed up until 2 a.m. correcting formulas. Mark was just a face. Another time, a major client event was scheduled. Danielle worked for weeks to organize every aspect: the venue, the deck, the financial breakdowns. On the day of the event, she was asked to remain at the office in case of emergencies. A colleague later sent her a photo. The entire leadership team lined up in front of the client, smiling, shaking hands, while her work lay buried behind their polished grands. At first, Danielle brushed it off as coincidence. Someone had to do the background work after all. Maybe they just trusted her more. Maybe they needed her where she was most useful. But then came the comments. "You're great at supporting roles," one senior leader remarked, casually, as though it were a compliment. Another said, "Clients love when they see someone relatable, someone they can trust, and you're so dependable." Dependable, supportive, reliable. Those words clung to her like labels she hadn't chosen. Words that seemed flattering on the surface but carried an undertone. You belong behind the scenes. The contrast was sharp when she compared her pad to her white colleagues. Danielle watched as newer hires, less experienced, less accomplished, were ushered into client dinners, given opportunities to present, encouraged to take risks. She saw how their mistakes were forgiven, reframed as bold leadership moves. Meanwhile, her perfection was expected, her mistakes magnified, her successes minimized. There was one moment that stayed with her like a bruise. A director praised her work in a team meeting. "Danielle, you really keep the ship afloat. We don't know what we'd do without you." The room clapped politely, but when another colleague presented later, the director leaned forward and said, "Now that is leadership material." Danielle sat frozen, the sting of the comparison sinking deeper than she wanted to admit. For years, she had convinced herself these were just bumps in the road, but slowly, doubt began to creep in. Late at night, staring at the ceiling, she replayed conversations in her head. She began asking herself questions she had long avoided. Why do they never let me lead the meetings? Why am I always the one cleaning up? Why is my work praised but never rewarded? The realization grew heavier each day. Maybe the problem wasn't her at all. Maybe the ladder she was climbing was designed with missing rungs, at least for people who looked like her. Still, Danielle clung to hope. She reminded herself of the words she'd heard for years. Your time is coming. She believed she just needed to prove herself one more time. Go the extra mile one more time. But what she didn't realize was that the system wasn't preparing her for leadership. It was preparing her to stay in place. And the breaking point was just around the corner.
The night before the big announcement, Danielle sat at her kitchen table with a notebook open, a cup of lukewarm tea forgotten beside her. She had started drafting a few lines, nothing extravagant, just words of gratitude she hoped would capture the moment. "Thank you for trusting me. I've learned from each of you. I believe in what we can achieve together." Her pen hovered above the page, but the words blurred as her mind raced ahead to tomorrow. She could already imagine the sound of her name echoing through the conference room, the applause, the way her mother's voice would light up when she called to share the news. Danielle smiled to herself, tucking the notebook into her bag. After all these years, it was finally her turn. That morning, she arrived early, nerves buzzing. The conference room was dressed for ceremony. Fresh coffee, a platter of muffins, chairs arranged in neat rows. Colleagues trickled in, some whispering predictions. Danielle caught snippets. It's between her and maybe Greg. Honestly, Danielle's earned it. She tried to contain the smile tugging at her lips. When the director walked in holding a crisp sheet of paper, the room hushed. Danielle's heart thudded. He began with the usual speech. This year has been exceptional. We've seen incredible growth. None of it would be possible without the dedication of this team. Danielle gripped her pen so tightly her knuckles whitened. Then came the moment. And so, it is my pleasure to announce our new department manager. A pause stretched. Greg Simmons! For a second, Danielle thought she had misheard. But the room erupted in claps, chairs scraping as people leaned forward to congratulate Greg. Greg, who had been at the company 3 years. Greg, who often came to her desk asking how to interpret client data. Greg, whose presentations she had polished countless times. Her body froze. Her chest tightened, like air was refusing to enter her lungs. She forced her hands together, clapping, though the sound felt hollow in her ears. She looked down, blinking quickly to stop the sting of tears. Greg grinned sheepishly, shaking hands, thanking people. Honestly, I couldn't have done it without Danielle. He glanced her way. The room laughed lightly, but no one looked at her. Not really. Their eyes slid past, as though acknowledging her pain might break the unspoken rules. Danielle sat motionless, heat burning through her veins. She thought of the late nights, the endless reports, the quiet sacrifices. She thought of the times her mother had told her, "Patience, baby, your moment will come." But this wasn't patience, this was theft. When the meeting adjourned, people crowded around Greg. Danielle stood slowly, her legs trembling, and slipped out the door. The hallway felt impossibly long, her footsteps echoing like accusations. In her office, she shut the door and collapsed into her chair. She reached into her bag, pulling out the folded page she had written the night before. The words of gratitude stared back at her, cruel in their optimism. She tore the page in half, then again until scraps littered her desk. For the first time, Danielle let herself wonder if this had never been about her work at all. Because if it wasn't about merit, then what was it about? That question lodged deep in her chest, sharper than the humiliation, heavier than the disappointment. And it was a question she would soon demand answers to.
When the applause faded and the conference room emptied, Danielle thought the hardest moment was behind her. But the days that followed proved that humiliation in public was only the beginning. At her desk, the silence was deafening. Colleagues who had once joked with her over coffee breaks now seemed cautious, their conversations clipped. When they did speak, their words were dipped in pity. "I'm so sorry, Danielle. I thought for sure it was your turn." She nodded politely, forcing a smile, but each remark landed like a fresh bruise. It wasn't just pity, it was avoidance. No one lingered by her office anymore. Emails that once began with casual greetings now arrived stripped down to sterile bullet points. She was still needed, still essential, but the warmth had evaporated, replaced by the chill of people who didn't want to be too close to disappointment. One afternoon, her closest friend at work, Maya, slipped into her office, closing the door behind her. Maya's eyes were full of conflict. She hesitated, then leaned forward and whispered, "You know why they didn't choose you, right?" Danielle frowned. "Because Greg?" "No, Greg wasn't even in the running until last month. Everyone knows you had it locked in. But let's be honest. Have you ever seen someone like us in management here?" The words stung because Danielle already knew the answer. In all her years at the company, not one black woman had held a managerial role. She wanted to believe it was coincidence, bad luck, a series of timing mismatches, but Maya's bluntness cut through those excuses like glass. "They can't picture you in that seat," Maya continued softly. They'll take your work, your loyalty, your results, but when it comes to putting you at the front, they always pick someone who looks more familiar. Danielle's throat tightened. Familiar, she repeated, the word heavy with unspoken truth. Later that week, her manager called her in for a private conversation. He smiled warmly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Danielle, I know this must be disappointing, but please don't be discouraged. Your time will come." Your time. Again with those words. She clenched her jaw. "Can you tell me why I wasn't chosen?" He shifted in his chair. "Greg has a strong rapport with clients. He presents confidently. Sometimes it's about perception, not just numbers." "Perception," Danielle echoed. "You mean appearances?" He chuckled nervously, raising his palms as if to diffuse the tension. "Now don't take it the wrong way. You're invaluable. Keep doing what you're doing, and the next opportunity could be yours." Could be, might be, maybe someday. Danielle walked out of his office feeling smaller than she had in years. Not because she lacked confidence, but because she realized she had been playing a game with rules she was never meant to win. That night, she sat in her apartment staring at her wall of plaques, awards for excellence, certificates for exceeding targets, tokens that were supposed to mean progress. Yet here she was, watching people she trained leapfrog over her into roles she was more qualified for. The plaques suddenly looked like chains, binding her to a system that praised her effort while denying her advancement. She wondered if they'd ever truly seen her, beyond the work she produced. Or had she always been invisible, just a convenient engine powering other people's success? She thought of Maya's words, of her manager's hollow reassurances, and of the way the office had turned cold, and she felt something shift inside her. This wasn't just disappointment anymore. It was betrayal. And betrayal demanded an answer.
Danielle knew the whispers, the evasions, the hollow reassurances couldn't be the end of the story. She had given too much, years of loyalty, excellence, and patience to let it all collapse into silence. So one morning, she gathered her courage, straightened her blazer, and asked for a meeting with the executive leadership team. She rehearsed the words in her head as she rode the elevator. Her pulse thumped in her ears, but beneath the nerves was a steady flame of determination. If they wouldn't give her answers willingly, she would demand them. The boardroom was intimidating. Polished mahogany table, high-backed leather chairs, city skylines stretching beyond the glass walls. The executives sat in a semicircle, their expressions calm, unreadable. Danielle sat opposite them, her palms flat on the table to keep them from trembling. "Thank you for seeing me," she began, her voice steady. "I asked for this meeting because I need clarity. I've dedicated 8 years to this company, exceeded every target, taken on every challenge. Yet when the manager role opened, I was overlooked for someone I trained. I want to understand why." The room went still. One of the senior executives cleared his throat. "Danielle, your contributions are invaluable. No one questions your dedication." She leaned forward. "But dedication isn't what gets promotions. Results do. And mine speak for themselves. So again, why wasn't I chosen?" There was a pause, followed by a careful, measured response. "Sometimes these decisions come down to intangible factors: client comfort, team dynamics, the image we want to project." Danielle's stomach tightened. "Image?" she repeated. Another executive chimed in, his tone patronizingly smooth. "Greg has a certain presence with clients. They see him and feel at ease. It's about familiarity." There it was again. The word familiar. Danielle locked eyes with him. Are you saying clients can't feel at ease with me? Silence. A shuffle of papers. A forced cough. No one dared answer directly, but the implication hung in the air like thick smoke. Danielle felt the heat rise in her chest. With all due respect, I've led projects that brought in millions in revenue. I've built relationships that outlasted entire teams. If clients don't see me as a leader, it's because you've never let them see me in the first place. The room stiffened. One of the executives leaned back, arms crossed. We're not questioning your talent, Danielle. It's just, these decisions are complicated. Complicated? Her voice cracked, sharp with restrained fury. What's complicated about recognizing achievement? What's complicated about rewarding merit? Unless what you're really saying is that someone like me doesn't fit your picture of leadership. The words hung there, impossible to retract. The executives exchanged glances, some uncomfortable, some defensive. Finally, the department head sighed. Danielle, we appreciate your passion, but this is the decision we made. We hope you'll continue to bring your best. Future opportunities will arise. Future opportunities. The same tired promise dressed up in corporate polish. Danielle sat back in her chair, her heart beat steady now, her anger sharpened into clarity. They weren't going to admit it, not openly, but in their carefully chosen words, in their refusal to look her in the eye, she heard the truth. It wasn't about her work. It was about her face, her skin, her identity. She walked out of that room with her head high, but something fundamental had shifted inside her. For the first time, Danielle understood that her battle wasn't against an unlucky decision or a slow-moving career ladder. Her battle was against a system that had never intended to let her climb at all. And if they thought she would swallow this quietly, they were wrong.
In the days after her confrontation with the executives, Danielle felt a mix of exhaustion and fire. She had spoken the truth out loud, in that polished boardroom, to faces that had never expected her to challenge the script. But truth alone wasn't enough. She needed to know if she was alone, or if others had lived this silent betrayal too. So she started reaching out, quietly at first. She invited colleagues she trusted, mostly people of color, for coffee, for lunch, for quick hallway chats that began with small talk but turned into confessions. What she heard both broke her heart and confirmed her worst fears. A young analyst told her he had applied for a leadership program twice and was rejected, even though his scores outperformed half the participants who were selected. Another woman, Latina, whispered that she'd stopped applying for promotions altogether. She just keeps saying, "I'm not quite ready." After 5 years, I think I know what that really means. The stories stacked up like bricks, each one echoing the same pattern. Excellence met with delay, promises that dissolved into thin air, doors that opened just wide enough to tease but never to let them through. One evening, Danielle sat across from Harold, a black colleague who had been with the company even longer than she had. His voice was calm, but the weight in his words was undeniable. "I've seen this play out for years," he said, stirring his coffee slowly. "They'll use us to build the foundation. They'll lean on us when things get tough. But when it's time to put someone at the top, they always pick the face they're comfortable with." Danielle swallowed hard. "So it's not just me." Harold gave her a look that was almost sorrowful. "It was never just you. That's the trick. They make us think it's our personal failing. Keeps us quiet. Keeps us grinding." That night, Danielle lay awake replaying those words, It was never just you. The realization was both painful and liberating. Painful because it meant her struggle wasn't unique. It was systemic, baked into the culture she had trusted. Liberating because it meant she wasn't crazy, wasn't paranoid, wasn't alone. But knowing the truth wasn't enough. Danielle wanted action. She began researching. Late nights turned into hours scrolling through case studies, diversity reports, articles on workplace discrimination. She found numbers that made her stomach churn. Black women accounted for a tiny fraction of management positions nationwide, despite being one of the most educated demographics. The stats mirrored exactly what she and her colleagues were living. And as she connected the dots, her determination solidified. This wasn't just a personal setback anymore. This was a pattern, a deliberate design. At work, Danielle noticed she wasn't the only one whose demeanor was shifting. After her confrontation with leadership, whispers had traveled. Some colleagues avoided her, wary of being associated with someone who had dared to question the system. But others started to lean in. She received subtle nods in the hallway, a quiet thank you from a junior employee she barely knew, an email with nothing but the words, "I heard what you said. Keep going." It was enough to remind her she had allies. And yet as more support she received, the clearer her next step became. Silence had protected the system for too long. Danielle had spoken privately to executives, she had gathered stories from colleagues, she had confirmed the numbers in black and white. Now she had a choice: accept the betrayal and continue playing her assigned role, or do something that could shake the very ground she stood on. Danielle knew what the safe choice was, but safe had cost her 8 years of invisible labor. Safe had given Greg the promotion that should have been hers. She wasn't going to play safe anymore, because Danielle wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for everyone whose name was never called.
Danielle's decision came quietly, but once it settled in her chest, it felt immovable. She would not be silent anymore. One evening, she sat at her kitchen table, the same place where she had once drafted a hopeful acceptance speech, and opened her laptop. This time, her words were not meant to be polite. They were meant to pierce. The letter she wrote was addressed to everyone in the company, not just the executives, not just her department, but every single employee whose inbox would ding with her name. She began with facts: 8 years of service, her track record of surpassing goals, the measurable results she had delivered. She wrote with precision, laying out what could not be denied. Then came the truth. She described the pattern, how she had been consistently kept in the shadows while others were given the spotlight, how promotions always seemed to skip past people who looked like her, no matter their qualifications, how she had confronted leadership and been met with vague words like image and familiarity, words that carried the weight of centuries of exclusion. Her tone was not bitter, but clear. "This is not just about me," she wrote. "This is about a system that continues to reward familiarity over merit, comfort over competence. My story is only one example of what too many of us live through silently. But silence has never built justice. It has only preserved injustice." She hit send at midnight, heart pounding, unsure of what storm she had just unleashed. The next morning, her inbox exploded. Some messages were terse, coworkers warning her she had jeopardized her future. Others were quietly grateful. "Thank you for saying what we couldn't." And then came the message from HR, asking her to come in for a conversation. But before that meeting could happen, something unexpected occurred. Her letter began circulating outside the company walls. Someone had forwarded it. Soon it was on social media, then picked up by a journalist who had been covering workplace discrimination. By the end of the week, Danielle's words were quoted in an online article titled "The Promotion That Never Reached Her Desk." The story struck a nerve Other employees from similar companies began sharing their experiences in the comments. A wave of recognition rippled outward. This wasn't one woman's story. It was an echo of thousands. Back at the office, tension thickened. Executives scrambled to control the narrative, but the truth was already loose, beyond their grip. Danielle sat through her HR meeting calmly, refusing to retract her words. "You can fire me," she said evenly, "but you cannot unwrite the truth." They didn't fire her. They couldn't, not while the eyes of the public were watching. Instead, they announced a review of internal promotion practices, a corporate bandage that Danielle knew was as much about damage control as it was about justice. But Danielle wasn't naive anymore. She knew change wouldn't come overnight, and it wouldn't come from the same people who had built the walls. Real change would come from pressure, from voices refusing to quiet down, from stories like hers being told and retold until no one could pretend not to see. She walked out of that meeting into a hallway buzzing with whispers. For the first time in years, she didn't feel invisible. She felt undeniable. Danielle had lost a promotion, but in speaking out, she had claimed something greater, her power and her refusal to be erased. And though the company might try to polish the story into something palatable, the truth remained like a crack in glass, visible, spreading, impossible to ignore. Because promotions can be denied, but truth has a way of breaking through every locked door.
Danielle's story began with hope. A hope so strong it carried her through late nights, endless sacrifices, and the quiet belief that merit alone could carve her path. For 8 years, she held on to the promise that if she worked harder, waited longer, smiled wider, the system would reward her. But when the moment came, the truth revealed itself with devastating clarity. It was never about her work. It was about the picture of leadership the company wanted to project, and Danielle didn't fit the frame. Her journey is not just one woman's heartbreak. It is a mirror reflecting what countless others have endured. The stolen opportunities, the invisible ceilings, the hollow reassurances that your time will come. The truth is, for many, that time never arrives, not because they lack talent, but because bias is baked into the very structure meant to uplift them. But Danielle refused to disappear into silence. She could have stayed quiet, accepted the betrayal, kept grinding in the shadows. Instead, she chose the harder path, the path of truth. With one letter, she pulled back the curtain, exposing what too many already knew but were too afraid to say. Her act of courage did not erase the injustice she faced, but it transformed her loss into something larger, a spark. A spark that lit conversations across boardrooms and break rooms, a spark that reminded others they were not alone. And that is the power of speaking up. It does not always bring immediate justice. It does not always change the decision in front of you. But it plants seeds of change, cracks the facade of silence, and reminds the world that injustice thrives only when we let it. Danielle's story leaves us with one undeniable lesson. Titles can be withheld, promotions can be stolen, but dignity and courage cannot be stripped away. So the next time you hear someone say, "Your time will come," remember Danielle. And remember that sometimes it is not about waiting for your time. It is about making it. If this story moved you, don't let it stop here. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment with your thoughts. And subscribe to this channel so we can keep bringing stories that demand to be told. Together, let's make sure voices like Danielle's are never silenced again.